Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's live broadcast, Startup to Commercialization, What Life Sciences Companies Need to Know. I'm Lisa Henderson, the Editorial Director of Pharmaceutical Executive, and I'll be your moderator for today's event. We are pleased to bring you this webcast presented by Pharmaceutical Executive and sponsored by Sikich. I would now like to share a statement from our sponsor. Sikich is a leading professional services firm specializing in technology, accounting, and advisory services. As a leading ERP for life sciences consultancy, Sikich has helped over 50 life sciences companies grow from pre-revenue to commercialization quickly and painlessly, allowing stakeholders to do what they do best, develop new medicines for patients who need them. We have a few important announcements before we begin. This webcast is designed to be interactive, and we do encourage you to ask questions during the event. You can submit questions by typing them in the Q&A box, which can be found on the right-hand side of your screen. You can enlarge the slide window by clicking on the small square icon in the upper right-hand corner of the slide window, or by hovering your mouse over the lower right-hand corner and dragging the window to the desired size. Your slides will advance automatically during the event. If you have any technical problems viewing or hearing this presentation, please click on the question mark help widget in the dock at the bottom of your presentation window. So now I'd like to introduce today's speakers. We are pleased to be joined today by William Tamulinas and Christopher Manchester. Billy has spent the last decade helping life sciences companies grow their business through ERP implementations. His expertise lies in guiding clients through business process changes and helping companies optimize the right solutions to configure and manage the roles, controls, and workflows life sciences companies need. Chris has been working with life sciences companies for nearly 10 years. With a background in finance, he helps life sciences organizations leverage technology to scale quickly and be prepared for any potential path the organization may take. So thank you, everyone, for joining us today. And Billy, would you like to get us started?
All right. Thank you, Lisa. So for today's presentation, we've titled it What Every Life Sciences Company Needs to Know. And what we've done is we've broken out our typical life science company's technology journey into 4 phases. So we're going to cover the startup phase, then we're going to transition into IPO and clinical trials, and those phases could really go in either order, and then we're going to finish off by talking about commercialization. So to jump right into our presentation, again, starting with the startup phase, we're going to talk about the challenges that an organization faces during those initial startup months and years, right? So really it all starts with that startup mentality, right? These are fast-paced organizations. You're really hyper-focused on innovation and being agile. And when you look at the typical makeup and the people within the organization, there's individuals that are wearing many hats, right? So you've got cross-functional teams with one common goal of advancing the company. So if you look at a finance department, we could see 1 or 2 individuals that are responsible for doing the books. And then when you get into budgeting and reporting, that that typical FP&A rule, that could be the same finance team still doing that. You could then find yourselves with an IT team that's outsourced. Your procurement team could be outsourced as well. And then you're also just going to see a multitude of different business processes as this company is beginning to evolve. The one saving grace you sort of have in the startup phase is there's a lot of manual processing, but you're able to accomplish it because of those light volumes. And now I'll just go ahead and Chris is going to take you through some of the common systems.
Perfect. Thank you, Billy. So what we'd like to look at is in the startup phase, we'd like to list out and identify what are the common business systems that these organizations are typically dealing with. And just to kind of go across here, the first one we think about is from an ERP perspective. Now, ironically, this is not traditionally the first system that's chosen. It's sometimes an afterthought. And what we're traditionally seeing is that QuickBooks is an industry standard for very early life science organizations. We're seeing that trend move a little bit where the folks are recognizing that they're far too quickly outgrowing their their QuickBooks environment or smaller scale ERP. And we're seeing that life sciences organizations are adopting a higher level ERP or a more robust system earlier on in their life cycle, like NetSuite. So a new theme in the industry is to move to more upmarket product sooner. Now, from an FP&A perspective, small organizations or even startups do have the same type of needs that large organizations have, just on a much different scale. So at this point, they're traditionally focused on things like budgeting, forecasting, and how that ties into financial reporting. Elements such as departmental burn rates. And at this point, it's typically a very manual effort and owned within the finance organization. So there's not a carved out FP&A role at this point, typically. From an analysis perspective, we're typically seeing a lot of ad hoc queries that are downloaded and manipulated within Excel, and this is common. From a reporting perspective, it's typically very static reporting, not refreshable or real-time, very Excel-based, and again, very manual in effort to build that type of reporting. From a procurement perspective, this is where we're seeing some of the largest deviations between life sciences organizations. So the procurement strategy is typically starting to be developed at this point because these organizations do need to buy both services and goods alike. One of the trends we're seeing in the Northeast, and Billy and I are located just outside of Boston, is leveraging a firm called BioProcure, and specifically their product of Prendio. This is a purchasing product application that's very much geared towards life sciences industry and the types of things that you're traditionally buying and selling with the vendors that you're typically working with. Other options are largely focused on both scientists and lab suppliers at this point. And then the last system or series of systems that we're typically coming across are approvals across the organization. This, again, is typically a very manual process. And most organizations do have a relatively complex approval matrix, even at the startup point. So we'll transition now to take a look at what types of things we're doing to kind of solve and provide the most value for these different approaches. So when we look at the challenges proposed in the areas that we just identified, the most room for improvement are in three kind of buckets. First is getting our clients on an ERP faster. We're finding that as we're going through the life cycle and the journey, the faster we can get them on a system that they can grow into that has some of the controls and scalability, such as NetSuite, the better, and the faster we can achieve some of the value that these life sciences organizations are striving for. The second is communicating leading practices. So part of what we've built out in our solution that we'll talk about in just a few slides here are leading practices around common areas of record to report, procure to pay, and what are most leading life sciences organizations doing in a very repeatable fashion. And the last is guiding decisions on functionality timelines. And what we mean by this is not chewing off too much in the beginning. You want to make sure that the timelines are achievable and providing value without creating all sorts of issues to your organization when you're in that innovation stage.
And going off those three needs that Chris just mentioned, that's where the Sikich success for life sciences, which is the implementation strategy and the product that we've branded, that's what it really tackles here, right? And so sort of how we do that, when we focus in on your implementation timeline, or what we call our implementation methodology, we're really hyper-focused on that speed to value, or as others call time to value. So that implementation is based off leading practices for your industry, such as managing approvals for, say, both the purchase of services versus lab supplies. And you really see that implementation methodology come into play when we first walk in the door. So we kick off the project by showing you and walking you through a pre-configured solution for your industry. We're not asking you, hey, you just bought an ERP system such as NetSuite. How do you want to configure it? We're saying, here's the ERP, here's pre-configured for your industry. Let's align your business to this solution. It gets us a lot further a lot quicker into the implementation. And so then with that, if we talk about, what can be your expectations for the implementation, you can expect both the Sikich team and NetSuite to automate business processes to handle a high and constantly growing volume of AP transactions. You should all, when come at month end, you're going to be able to accurately report on your R&D versus G&A costs. You're going to be able to produce an SEC income statement. Right? And then lastly, you're going to be able to get granular in your reporting and track program and or project spend at a very detailed level and report those numbers out in comparison to a budget to the different stakeholders in your business.
So let's take a look at what we've built inside the NetSuite platform to accommodate these needs. This graphic is displaying the functionality provided in the Sikich Success for Life Sciences. Like building a house, Tier 1 is the foundation, and Tier 2 carries additional functionality meant to support your organization during its life cycle. So if we take a look at the elements that are within Tier 1, the first thing we're going to talk about is company structure. And here's where we're identifying what legal entities you're managing. We bring up the concept of subsidiaries, intercompany transactions, eliminations, and all that goes within managing an environment that contains multiple legal entities. One of the really important areas that we focus on is the segmentation strategy and automation. Here's where we're aligning our solution to how your life sciences organization perceives its business. We identify things like projects, programs, departments to really drive the reporting that you're striving for, both from a financial and operational perspective. Approval processes span many different areas, so we can start to consider where do we want to put those approval processes and what stage of the project do we want to do that. Things like financial approvals, AP approvals, new vendor approvals, and that runs all the way through various areas of the system. At this point, role management becomes important from a base layer perspective. So we want to identify what roles are you leveraging right now? How are those roles going to grow? And make sure that we're making the system scale enough that it supports your needs at a small perspective, but has the ability to grow as your organization grows. Like Billy was referencing earlier, the SEC financials, we do come with a package out of the box so that we're not recreating the same reports that we're seeing across all of the various life sciences organizations that we work with. System audit is a big one for getting an introductory level look at what type of controls and procedures we need to put in place as we move into more of an IPO type setting. Billy will talk a little bit more about vendor study management, but at a summary level, this is our ability to manage some of the higher level studies or clinical trials that traditionally have been very manual to account for and to keep track of in an offline basis. The Prendio connector gives us the ability to integrate with the BioProcure Prendio system from a purchasing and AP perspective to really avoid manual duplicate entries or uploads. And then vendor onboarding talks a bit about what we've put in place from a vendor approval process and an ongoing management of those vendors, both from an address, banking information, primary information perspective.
Awesome. And then building upon that Tier 1, we'll look at some of our Tier 2 functionality. So, Chris mentioned in Tier 1, you may be connecting to an outside procurement system, but you may find a need to bring procurement into your ERP. Say you're purchasing a high level of service contracts, or you're thinking about going commercial and you're going to have inventory in your ERP system. That's where using POs inside the ERP becomes very valuable. And then going off that PO being in the system, that's where we get into purchase change orders. And really, change orders in a lot of systems, typically the best practice is just go ahead and issue a new PO. But with some of the IP we've built around clinical studies, it's important to keep that one PO intact and just add dollars to the PO for additional milestones in a very controlled, SOX-compliant fashion. Then some additional functionality in Tier 2, you're looking at things like document management. Do contracts need to be linked to your POs? In terms of expense management, are you going to implement expense reports in a mobile application for capturing expenses in your ERP? You're going to connect to, say, Concur and Expensify. And then also, as your organization is growing, Excel might be too much to manage fixed assets, and you'll need to bring that into your ERP to gain automation around booking month-end depreciation. And then lastly, you might find yourself beginning to build out your item or your product structure in NetSuite, as you're looking to code costs to specific drugs and what it takes to ultimately make and sell that drug. So with that, that concludes the first stage, and we're going to now transition into the IPO stage of our story. So kicking that off with some of the challenges you're likely to see as you're nearing an IPO. I think that in an ideal world, you're able to say, okay, great, stage one just took place, and you're on an established ERP system like NetSuite. But it's not uncommon to be starting the process now, and that's perfectly okay. But the first challenge I think you're going to immediately run into is the timing of the IPO, right? Truthfully, you don't necessarily know when this is going to happen. The business could be thinking about going public, but they could also be at the same time thinking about raising another round of financing from through private equity. So it's never really a guarantee or a known date of when the public offering takes place. But as you feel it coming, it is really important for that pre-IPO prep. So finance teams are going to begin to drive a culture shift within the organization towards internal controls. So that startup mentality, that fast pace, now individuals are slowing it down a bit, putting controls in place, specifically around your purchasing processes, and heavy on the approvals there, so that you can begin to operate as if you are a public company. Okay? And then the one caveat we always like to remind everyone there is, as you're going through the IPO and as you go public, there of course is a grace period, so that your organization does have the ability to ramp up your systems essentially support this new requirement of being public. But it's always great to get a head start and be thinking about it before actually going public. And then, with that, in terms of, so the types of things you should also be thinking about as you go in, beginning to think about your IPO, I'm going to hand it off to Chris to talk about your organization structure.
Perfect. Thank you, Billy. So typically in the IPO fundraising phase, we're seeing a few common traits, especially around your organizational structure. So at this point, you have a growing organization, but it's still running quite lean. You're expected to do more with the same amount of people, and that's where we really end up trying to focus. Folks are still wearing multiple hats. They're doing a lot of different things. Finance might still be in control of FP&A. They may be overseeing the accounting side of the purchasing process. So you're still very much, a very lean organization that folks are doing multiple different pieces of the puzzle. At this point, we're really starting to see where annual expenditures are starting to grow upwards. Your transaction volumes are significantly increasing. And what we have to do at this point is make sure we take a look and ask the question, does your management structure support your approval matrices? So the approvals and the compliance that we were implementing when we were in the startup phase, is it still relevant or does it need to be updated? Now, with a system like NetSuite, we do have the flexibility to expand that with relative ease, but it is important to constantly review to make sure that the approvals and segregations and controls that we put in the startup phase are still supported with this growing organization. We start to look at segregation of duties, and we want to start to review what are our deployment strategies. So we have a controlled system here, and how do we make sure that we're making relevant safe changes to your application or ERP application without forfeiting control and compliance. We're also starting to take a look at roles a bit further. So the product does support many different types of users. At this point, permissions do become paramount, right? So again, we think we're prepping for the IPO. We're starting to possibly make our roles more granular, more specific to what folks are kind of doing in their particular point in time. and making sure that we have good segregation of duties as we start to prepare for those pre-IPO activities.
Getting into some of the IPO audit pressures, we've really broken those down into 3 key categories. So when you're implementing an ERP, your data migration strategy and how you're going to handle that at go live is critical, and it's going to impact your first quarterly audit after your go live. Right? So can't tell you how many clients ask us to go live the first day of a quarter, a month, a year, but at the end of the day, that really doesn't matter. Your best option when implementing ERP is to make a clean cut from your system. And we typically recommend the 3rd week of a month because that's when an accounting team is typically the least busy. But ultimately, from an audit perspective, by making a clean cut, you're done using your old system, say QuickBooks, you're migrated onto NetSuite, and now everything is in NetSuite on a go-forward basis. So it's much easier to prove out to your auditors that you've converted your data correctly into the new system. Okay? And then sort of shifting away from data and now just, getting into working in the system and, undergoing an audit while you're on NetSuite. Our next one is sort of your system controls, right? So segregation of duties is absolutely critical when you're public. So keeping in mind that your team is probably, it's still somewhat lean, and people might still be wearing multiple hats. That's where having a system that's flexible allows you to define rules both through your typical permissions, but also then has workflow that put additional controls and approvals in place, really help you prove out those system controls and write very strong stories to give to a SOX auditor when they're asking, how the system works. And then lastly, from a change management perspective, again, your company is still going to be growing. There's going to be new functionality you want to implement, and there's going to be new business challenges that need to be solved in your ERP system. And so it's really critical here to get IT's involvement in terms of documenting what changes are going to be, understanding what's native functionality versus custom, and really putting good policies and procedures in place for when something new is implemented. How has the team tested it? Has it changed any of those SOX stories we talked about? And then ultimately, has there been a sign-off by, say, your controller or CFO before it's getting put into a production environment?
So we're going to continue this theme of speed to value across the presentation here. So when we think of speed to value as it relates to the IPO phase, we are finding it beneficial to separate the implementation of a system with developing and configuring all of the elements of control and compliance. A couple slides ago, Billy mentioned that these organizations do have a grace period, and that fits really well with the deployment of this functionality. What we're finding is that too often organizations are bogged down with combining both of these elements, and it typically will lead to project delays and frustration. So what we've done here is we've laid out sort of our ideal scenario of the path of bringing in systems and then layering in new controls. So our ideal path follows the establishing a strong ERP. So we talked about that in the front end with the kind of the startup phase, is bringing in an ERP that can support all of this functionality earlier in the process. The next is user adoption. So getting folks into the system, comfortable with using it. This is paramount for what's about to come next. And the next thing that we typically like to layer in is the controls after they've been fully defined. So what we always talk about is we want to make sure that the controls are being defined outside of the system and not trying to use the system to define controls. Right? Ultimately, the outcome of all of this is system adoption. So once we've established our ERP, really laid out what the controls would be, layer in those controls on top of the IP, that kind of is the dream scenario in terms of overall system adoption for all of the stakeholders.
And getting a bit more into sort of that controls versus flexibility conversation. So and it might seem funny to say this, but controls are a lot easier to implement when an accounting or finance team are larger. If you're a 10, 15 person department, you can very easily break out who's doing what. Say 2 people are entering vendor bills and 2 other people are responsible for paying them. So, in that type of environment, roles are, much more clearly separated. But again, in these early phases, that's not going to be the case. And so some of the areas we typically focus on are in starting with is scalability. So, as an organization, you need an ERP system that's going to support your lean team and give you the ability to have full segregation of duty. Right? And then, building upon that, there then comes, your transaction complexity, right? So not every transaction you enter into a system is straightforward, right? Sometimes you're going to have to make updates or changes to a transaction. There's numerous roles and people that get involved. You're going to see cross-departmental and program project approvals taking place, where you also need to ultimately define who's the owner, and you might find a hard time of actually, understanding and knowing who actually owns the transaction. And then with all that, ultimately you're going to ask yourself, are the controls logical, right? When you're getting into sort of your month-end close, and one of the most common things you're going to hear from anyone looking to sell or implement ERP systems is, are you going to expedite that month-end process for us? Ultimately, the key stakeholders that they want the numbers as quickly as possible. But controls can hamper that process, and so it's really critical to have controls that still support your automation. And then lastly, the sort of last bullet point we have here is who within your organization is going to be that system administrator, right? Who's ultimately responsible for monitoring the system, setting up new users, making sure the controls are being followed, both from a segregation of duty standpoint and from a change management perspective. And it's really critical that that person is in-house within your organization and not outsourced. And then, when we get into our talk of controls and flexibility, over here on the right, we have a screenshot of one of the approval flows from NetSuite. And so when it comes to setting up a vendor record, how we've made it both controlled and then both flexible is when someone enters a vendor into the system, it goes out for approval. And the person who approves the vendor is someone different than who created it. But then when we get down to that last approved state at the bottom, you'll see an arrow going back up to approval. So anytime someone makes an edit to a vendor record, that record is then going out for approval, again, to a different person. And at the same time, we're blocking any payments in the system from going out to this vendor. So you find yourself with, always, for a change to take place to a vendor record, always needs to be 2 people, one to execute it, one to approve it, and for the ability to not pay unapproved vendors. And again, this is just one sampling of a workflow that you'll see in the system.
Perfect. So we couldn't get out of here without a slide about reporting, but what you're seeing here is what we're considering an SEC income statement. So part of what we built into the solution is a prepackaged piece of financial reporting that we're seeing very common across the life science industries. And again, these are very flexible. They can be changed, updated, but we build these as a starting point, right? So we can come in with a prepackaged. Some of the areas that we focus on are being able to report on things like R&D versus G&A, filing your 10K. Ultimately, what we want to do is, again, as Billy referred to earlier, is expedite that fiscal close activities. It's really important that the ERP system comes with out-of-the-box financials that can be refreshable, real-time, have drill-down capabilities. Some of the areas that we also focus on when it comes to reporting are the distribution of reports. Do we want to put these on a schedule? Do we want to push these out to department heads, program heads, project heads, financial management on a regular basis to avoid and cut down on some of the manual activities? Also on publishing your financials, we want these to look professional, be able to include them in things like board packages or to external stakeholders, but we also want them to be flexible enough that they support internal review and analysis of the folks that are operating inside the ERP system. So just an example here of some of the different elements of financial reporting that you should consider as your journey continues through the life cycle.
All right, so that concludes our second stage of IPO, and we're going to transition now to the third stage, what we're titling clinical trials. And we're going to again start with, what are the challenges you're facing when it comes time for clinical trials. So again, clinical trials, they may come pre or post IPO. It's very common for these to mostly come pre-IPO. But what we find is, managing these clinical trials and managing the cost, the activity, is very commonly a highly manual process performed by accountants at month end or quarter end. And you're typically looking at 2 to 3 days of, one person's time fully dedicated to managing this process. So in addition to capturing and accurately reporting on all that cost, there then comes that sort of that audit aspect to this. So, what we find is a lot of clients are managing this initially in Excel, and then having to go through an audit with a large Excel workbook has its challenges. And then, in addition to having to capture all this information in Excel, there's a lot of communication going on. There's a lot of people involved, both within and outside the organization. There could be multiple clinical trials per department, and you're getting all those different department heads involved to pull information. And then you're also going to find yourself communicating with vendors. They may or may not have sent you the bill yet, but have they completed certain milestones on the clinical trial journey? So I think, as you can see, it's a very collaborative process, but with all that collaboration comes a need for a lot of approvals. And then what we're also seeing is legal documentation and trending a little bit towards integrations with third parties is becoming a big requirement because it's not as simple as just issuing a PO to the vendor executing the clinical trial.
Yeah, thank you, Billy. Just to continue on that path, like Billy was mentioning, the file storage and document management requirements grow more complex at this stage. So if you think about the transition of a contract being managed solely on a purchase order in your ERP, now we may introduce the need for more contract management type functionality. Many clinical trials are high in value and introduce a level of legal support. Changes and modifications to contracts at this point are common. And some of the tools that we're seeing and leveraging integration with at this point include applications such as AgileOff, Conga, and there's a lot of different type of contract management tools out there that we've, at this point, integrated with NetSuite. The most manual process is the financial tracking of these clinical trials and the communication with the vendors regarding the levels of completion. This is typically handled through a high volume of Excel spreadsheets and email communication. So what we'd like to do at this point is understand what type of communications are we working with now, how are we performing those communications, and ensure that we have systems and processes set up to better support and automate some of those so that, again, like Billy was mentioning, it's not such a manual effort that's done outside of your ERP or outside of a legal system that can lend itself for audit issues, errors, and just general over maintenance of these particular areas. So again, talking in the clinical trial phase, and like Billy mentioned, this phase can be pre or post IPO, where we're kind of isolating this as its own phase, but it does tend to have flexibility in where it comes in. But what we're seeing is that with clinical trials, we're seeing a shift in some of the roles and responsibilities of these organizations. Where we saw that roles were traditionally more siloed, clinical trials do require a higher level of collaboration across these functional teams. So for example, scientists and operations now may need visibility into things like budgets, right? Providing input into the budgets and feedback as to where we are from a budget to actual perspective in their different functional areas. Finance relies on the input of percent completes and project changes. So your buyers, your operations, and your scientists may now be involved in some of the percent complete type accounting for managing these clinical trials where they traditionally may not have been. And as one can imagine, these contracts are highly visible to management because they're high dollar. So leadership does take a role evolution in this particular phase because they need a different level of reporting and visibility that they didn't traditionally need when the organization was either smaller or didn't manage as many clinical trials as they are today.
All right, so in its most simplistic form, Sikich has introduced the concept of a project or a vendor study into our dimensional chart of accounts and purchasing processes. And so ultimately, what we're looking to do here is, you may be used to issuing a PO for a clinical trial, but we're introducing a dimension or a segment to better manage the cost spend and then also the budget or forecast spend for this contract. So then, on top of that dimensional chart of accounts, look and feel, we're also giving organizations the ability to establish a monthly project plan or a quarterly project plan to track incurred costs versus actual invoicing, and then ultimately to automate your month-end or quarter-end general ledger entries for your prepaid or accrual position on this contract. And again, that's that prepaid or accrual position. We typically see that calculation out in Excel workbooks. And when you have 100 of these contracts going on, that's when the audit pressures really build up in that area. So by having it all in NetSuite, your ERP system, that allows you to produce a backup report for those two balance sheet accounts to very easily produce it and then give it to your auditors so they know exactly what's going on in those two accounts and don't have to reference Excel workbooks. And on our next slide, so just have a quick screenshot or example of what that looks like. So this is for one clinical trial or vendor study as we call it in the system. This is 1 month's entry, and so you essentially see we have a project called Phase 2. It's for April 2019, and what we've planned to incur is $10K in cost. And at month end, we would come in and update that plan to be what was truly incurred, and that's typically through conversations with again, whoever the owner within the business is or even the vendor to understand what's incurred. And then the system's going to go and it's going to calculate for you what has been planned or incurred contract to date, what's been invoiced to us contract to date, and then are we in that prepaid or accrual position. And ultimately the system will book that entry for you automatically so that you have, again, you have this full level of detail linked back to your general ledger and your financial reporting.
Perfect. So that actually got us all the way through our clinical trials phase. And now we're going to talk to some of the elements about going commercial. So the following sections are intended to provoke some thoughts and insights into the life sciences organizations that are planning for commercialization. Some of the strategy decisions that organizations face include what are your legal, regulatory, and internal reporting requirements as you think about your commercial strategy? Does the organizational roadmap look, what does it look like? What are your goals? What is the vision for the future? Is the intention to remain R&D focused, continue to develop solutions, or move more into things like product manufacturing? At this point too, we do ask some of the harder questions like, is the exit strategy to grow or looking at a possible acquisition? Does the nature of your product introduce FDA and compliance different type regulations? And then we have to also look at things like product and supply chain visibility. And in terms of ownership, when do you plan on taking ownership of your inventory? How much visibility do you need into the supply chain movements of your products? And also, even if you're not maintaining the inventory in your ERP, for example, or at an accounting level, do you still require visibility of where those inventory levels are and at what locations are they sitting? Some other type decisions are, where are you trending in terms of your decision to use contract manufacturing, outsourced manufacturing, or even contract sales organizations? we do at this point understand that organizations might not have the bandwidth to go ahead and start manufacturing their own products, selling their own products, elements such as order management. So some of those decisions are key at this point. It is important to know that established ERP systems like NetSuite do support many different inventory management, manufacturing, and order management capabilities, but it is very important to have a game plan going in. We don't want to look at the system and say, what can the system do for us? We want to look at our business and say, what do we want our business to do? And then the system will accommodate those needs. In the next area, Billy's going to focus on some details specific to the manufacturing perspective.
Yeah, so regardless if your manufacturing is in-house or you're using a third party, your organization definitely will still require some systemic manufacturing capabilities built into your ERP. So, on one side of the fence, you're doing everything 100% in-house. On the other side, it's 100% third party. But most commonly, we see, all of our life sciences landing somewhere in between that, right? So just, to give an example, so if maybe you're in a contract manufacturing scenario where someone else is producing the drug on behalf of your company, you're going to find that you may still have that need to report WIP on your balance sheet, right? So it's not as simple as just issuing a PO to the contract manufacturer for the drug. When you issue that PO, you're still going to need to be managing or potentially managing your assembly or your BOM and what components go into making that drug. Some other things you're going to have to take into account is, ultimately is, how is the product made? Is there or how much labor gets involved in the process? What's your time scale? Is your manufacturing process, is it specific to a project? Are you making a drug? Or is it even patient specific? And then across, ultimately, how many locations, physical locations, are you manufacturing? Is it all centralized to one, or is it, globally or across the country, right? And then you sort of, take all that into account. It's also important to define the makeup of your products. So, does this product contain a bill of materials? To what levels do the components break down? Are the bill of materials, are they made up of quantities? Are they recipe-based? Those are some of the things you're going to need to consider. Transitioning off manufacturing, we'll hand it back to Crystal to talk about the inventory management side.
Yeah, perfect. So again, like Billy just drilled into some of the elements, the decisions that we're making around the manufacturing of these products. But from a pure inventory perspective, we're seeing that inventory management introduced a significant strategy shift for your organization. The tracking of your inventory items versus non-inventory items or expense items becomes important, where we might have purchased goods and materials that we weren't tracking either on a quantity perspective or the balance sheet. We may transition and start to track those quantities and the balance sheet impacts of them. There's challenges that are created due to the use of outside purchasing systems. If the systems that we were traditionally used for purchasing aren't tying into our inventory and more just at an AP type level, we need to make sure that we're accommodating for that and think about at this point making a shift. The leading procurement systems will require a tighter integration into your ERP environment. So again, shifts from moving just possibly from an AP integration to more purchasing, receipting, supply planning, and product catalogs. We are seeing that inventory movements do come in a lot of different forms. If you are thinking about managing inventory inside your ERP, the ERP must be configured to support moving inventory from one physical or virtual location to another, identifying bins or sub-locations within a warehouse or lab, dealing with loss, damages, not usable inventory, scrap, relieving that inventory. So, if we're moving inventory around either to location or different areas of your lab or warehouse, if that inventory is used up, how are we going to relieve that? Who's going to input that into the system? And then, of course, very important is providing the proper accounting for the inventory ownership and when in the process does that occur. An important element at this phase is whether There's traceability requirements. We want to start asking questions like, is your product required to be lot numbered or serial numbered for tracking purposes? And do you need to have visibility into the lot or serial item in every step of the supply chain? I think, as a wrap-up, we also always ask questions, we want to provide insight as to where the product was shipped and where the item was sourced from a traceability perspective, and where in the process does that come into play. And at that point, we're going to move into the last piece of commercialization, and Billy's going to talk a little bit about the order management side.
Awesome, thanks, Chris. So from an order management perspective, or what we like to call order to cash in NetSuite, again, you have that question, is this in-house or is this third party? We do see organizations with contract sales organizations helping out. But before you even get to that order, it's important to have a strategy around your customer relationship management solution, or the acronym typically you hear out there is your CRM. So are you going to do this in your ERP? Are you going to go out and implement a leading CRM solution such as the Salesforce? And so as you capture those leads, opportunities, and convert them into orders, you're then going to be tackling how do we invoice? Is it up front? Is it on a specific schedule? And then invoicing and shipping are most commonly going to be separated, right? So you could invoice one way and at one time, and then you could ship another time. And once you've done all that, other things to consider are, cash management, or, AR, how you ultimately going to collect cash. Are they going to be sending, wiring money to your bank account, or do you need to implement, say, a more automated solution for capturing payment? And then there's also revenue recognition layered on, right? So when the order is booked, you have a contract, you're ready, you're potentially ready to recognize revenue, but it's critical to make sure you've defined, what are the triggering events for revenue recognition, and what will ultimately lead to automated system journal entries in NetSuite.
So what we've shown you today is a typical life cycle of a life sciences organization, and it was intended to get you thinking about where you are in your process, what the next step should be, and how Sikich can help with those pending decisions. So we thank you for your time today. If you want to learn a little bit more about Sikich and how we've helped out life sciences organizations in the past, please feel free to either reach out to us or visit our website, and we hope you have a nice day.
So thank you, Chris, and thank you, Billy, for your informative presentations. Unfortunately, we are out of time. I want to thank the audience for attending and for participating in today's event. And I would also like to thank our sponsor, Sikich, for making today's educational webcast possible. You will receive an email alerting you when this webcast will be available for replay. We invite you to forward that announcement to your colleagues who may have missed today's live event. So thanks again, everybody, for joining, and we will see you next time. Bye-bye.